Look, I'm rather strange participant here. Although I was always interested in authority, this didn't make me particularly interested in sovereignty because of its rather absolute notion of understanding the relationship between authority, rights, and territory. And in fact, I always was interested in the triangle, while most of the discussions we had so far, with exceptions of Chris Lord, who talked about those externalities, you know, they focus on the relationship between authority and rights, and territory is taken for given. I don't think it can be taken for given, not just because of the concept of sovereignty, which is bound to certain territory, but also because the concept of democracy is also bound to certain territory and people who live within certain borders. What is this triangle, authority, rights, and territory is a typical Weberian concept. I haven't invented it, of course, but it's very important to emphasize it because these days, these are usually geographers who bring this territory forward, while political analysts kind of are not very much interested in, particularly after globalization study went out of fashion. But it is a crucial concept. Take Rousseau, or take more modern people like Robert Dahl. They all believe that, you know, that you have to refer to territory and to design borders of a state and democracy as such. So if you look at those problems from this perspective, you do not focus on state only, or the conflict between state and supranational authorities like the EU, but you also look down at local authorities, regions and cities. And of course, as we speak, we are confronted with very strong sovereignty claims by some regions. But I actually find cities more interesting because cities are not much interested in sovereignty, yet they are interested in authority. And in fact, they exercise this authority more and more. But the way they look at problems is different than state-like authorities, because they are more interested in problem solving rather than acquiring, demarking, or controlling territory. And since these are all multinational, the large cities in particular are multinational hotspots, they have little time for national pride and glory, right? And they require human capital, connectivity, and innovation to prosper. And this requires a different way of governing based on more informal, for instance, arrangement, rather than formal or hierarchical. This is important, you see. Now, I do not, and main of the reason, this makes a difference because even in the case of the EU, there is always this dilemma, nation state or European state, right? Even it's very often denied, but you know, you come to this question each time you have to delegate real powers, right? Like most of even Eurosceptics would agree that you cannot have common currency without common fiscal government, but if you would delegate those powers to the EU, states would commit collective suicide and transform themselves in a kind of local government within the EU if you cannot decide about fiscal policies. By the way, not by accident in the process of European integration. We had more proliferations of common rules and the system of policing them than the transfer of real powers, right? Because the gatekeepers here were nation states, and you know, the EU is the playing field, so to speak. Sometimes willy-nilly they end up you know, with losing some powers, or at least changing their characteristics. I refer here to Chris' book on member states and how they differ from nation states. But this is never the intention, right? And the same with regions. They also are status in a way. You know, Catalonia wants to be independent state. Scotland wants to be an independent state, and so, you know, cities don't have this ambition, and therefore it's interesting to look at them too. The second thing is that when I'm interested in something people call effective exercise of authority. You know, each political system reflects certain equilibrium between what is private, what is public, between winners and losers of particular conflicts, and the system of redistribution and so on. Sometimes those things are legalized, sometimes these are informal equilibrium. And in my view, they can work as long as the, say, formal arrangement doesn't contrast too much with the reality on the ground. Because you can claim powers from natural law or God, but if you cannot really deliver, there is a problem, right? Now, states' claim to sovereignty was always based on law, which they wrote themselves, so I don't take it too seriously in analytical discussion, although I know that lawyers, I'm a lawyer by education, take it seriously, and there's good reason for this. But what is important, this is what Chris always emphasizes, and a lot of you in your, this democratic legitimacy. But what has happened in recent years, for various reasons, most of them related to something I called unbounding, is that first they delegated more and more work to various other units, whether the EU or regions or cities. I always say to my students, look, think about things you are really worried daily, today, yeah? Where, for instance, where you find a job? How will you get to this job? Where you put your children to school or your mother to the hospital? These are all things which were delegated to cities today. And cities actually are in charge practically, although not formally, for issues which used to be symbols of the state, which is, for instance, migration. Or if you look at security, I mean, most of anti-terrorism activity is concentrated in cities because this is where the major acts are being perpetrated, and most of these people live there, and if only because they can hide there and in their own communities. So there was this proliferation, these delegations of tasks to various other units, and you know better than me how those tasks were delegated to the EU, without really without delegating powers, right? So it was cities, regions, EU were asked to do yet another thing without getting powers and resources.
3 minutes just.
A second thing which has happened, to various degrees, you know, I'm talking in a very general terms, so you can always find examples which contradict this. But this was a tendency sometimes there was a devolution, right? And not each time there was a devolution, you just heard Boris Johnson, what he thinks about it. He regrets the devolution. Right? The same with delegating power to the EU. The very moment the EU becomes more autonomous, the states are, saying, no, thank you very much. No, I follow Polish discussion these days very closely. We want EU money, but we don't want EU to tell us what to do with anything. Basically, we want to run by decree, and that's it. So, but the second part of this was that, and which is probably even more important, is that the major channel of representing the people, which is parliamentary democracy in the member states, has been gradually eroding. And this is not to say that we have any alternatives, yeah? Because I'm not great enthusiast of democracy in the EU, nor do I believe that per definition regions or cities are more democratic. Yes, if you adopt Sartori principle that the real democracy is participatory, it's of course easier to have participatory democracy on the local level than national or European, but there are good examples and bad. I never, I'm not one of those who would tell you, if my late friend Barber was saying, if the mayors would run the world rather than prime ministers, everything will be fine, yeah? He makes compelling argument, but I think he overstates the point. There are cities which are effective and democratic and those who are the opposite. The same with states, the same with, I don't take any of those units as particular efficient and inefficient, democratic or undemocratic. They have to prove their point, so to speak. But the truth is that this delegation was spreading of responsibilities, but not power. And democracy, which was taken by granted, has been eroding. And you can say many things why it has been eroding. And you read all these books about this. Some blame populists, others blame political parties, other people blame parliaments as such and dysfunctional system of parliamentary representation. And we can go on and on. But in my view, one of the major reasons was that what Robert Dahl was always pointing to is that the borders of democracy started to diverge from the borders when you solve problems, and the stakeholders basically started to be different. And this is a problem, because you can run elections promising people, I don't know, pensions, hospitals, whatever, but you cannot make those promises, implement those promises, because if you do these days, those promises, you are just totally shattered by markets, for instance, right? But you can talk about other, in the field of defense, you can make promises, we will defend our borders, but how can you defend your, cyber attacks on your borders, right? Or nuclear weapons use on, so it depends, it's not just economics. And when this happens, you of course have to look at what you call sovereignty, and I call it authority, in entirely different ways. And this opens up discussions rather than closes it, because I think you can only arrive at the new equilibrium through kind of revolutionary change. Maybe pandemics will be such a, factor which will impose new equilibrium. Maybe we thought populists will do this, or don't, with rather dismal effects. We don't know. but what I believe is that that we are living in this period when the old equilibrium is unsustainable. The king is, so to speak, naked, and we have somehow to work out the new division between authority, rights, and the territory. That's it.